welcome to the Wrestling with the Faith podcast, episode 2. We're back for round 2. We made it through the first one. So in this week we're going to be discussing Matthew 18:15 through 20, and what Jesus is calling us to do and how we handle sins in the church and with others. So if you're new, welcome. If you've watched the first one, welcome back. My name is Evan. I am just a churchgoer, or we're a group of churchgoers that are here to wrestle with these questions and get some discussion going within our group and with everybody else. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen, even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them.
We did a chapter in a book called When Christians Get It Wrong a few years back, and we talked about this particular passage, I think, and it was a discussion about Christians have used this to go out and tell the world that they're wrong, that they've sinned, and that if they don't change their ways based on whatever this particular sin was, that congregation would no longer consider them a Christian. And so they've kind of taken this to go out and tell the world they're a bunch of sinners, kind of thing. And so they kind of talked about how that kind of turns people off, as opposed to, this is talking about inside the church. If you disagree about whether something is the right thing to do or not, go together and talk about it and try to work it out, and continue to do that and make groups larger and larger until you get to a solution.
So yeah, one of the comments Pastor Tom made in his email was, as you read through, kind of see what is that passage calling you to be or to do or to say or so on. Mm-hmm. And this is, going to us saying, figure out how do we handle sin? How are we supposed to handle that when we see it? Do we sit by and do nothing, or like you guys were saying, it's like go talk to the person and work it out first as individuals, just the 2 of you, see if you can work it out, and then see if you.
What do you think of the if what you bind here on earth is bound in heaven, and what you loose on earth is loosed in heaven? What do you think about that?
For me, it'd be binding is stuff you agree to or say you're going to do is also going to be, held up when in heaven, and anything you let loose. So going out and doing something, going like your acts out in the world, basically anything you do and say is also going to exist when you get up to heaven. So to me, it's leading towards, if you're making sure you're keeping a good word and good actions while you're here, and that will be recognized, when you move on to God's kingdom, versus if you do something bad or you stay and do nothing, that'll also be you'd be like almost held accountable, I guess. So kind of helping to try and keep accountability to your actions.
Yeah, I had trouble with that one verse that Dave and I were talking about. I don't know. I don't really understand what it means. But so you're suggesting
Yeah, so we have the Cheater Bible again, so we can help us through.
So here's what it says about that verse 18:18. This prohibiting and allowing refers to the decisions of the church in conflicts. Among believers, there is no court of appeals beyond the church. Ideally, the church's decisions should be God-guided and based on discernment of His Word. Believers have the responsibility, therefore, to bring their problems to the church, and the church has the responsibility to use God's guidance in seeking to resolve conflicts. Handling problems God's way will have an impact now and for eternity. But I'm not sure that clears it up too much for me.
Clearly, we've got some responsibility.
I was just looking up the nice thing using the Bible Gateway website. You can choose, any number of versions. And flipping through them, I'm looking at the contemporary English version, which is the first one I found that doesn't use bind, bound, and those terms. Where this one says, "I promise you that God in heaven will allow whatever you allow on earth, but He will not allow anything you don't allow." Which, I don't know, for me, again, going back to the idea of, if you just sit there and do nothing while someone does something bad, it's saying, okay, you're allowing that, and that'll be, allowed in, he's saying it'll be allowed in heaven. And I think that's going back to the accountability and trying to make sure that people are, holding us accountable for ourselves, but then also making sure that we're working with others to make sure we're not doing or saying anything bad, and trying to help make sure we're, being the best that we can be to others.
So does this mean that if we, as members of a church, decide that a particular thing is a sin, and a few of us get together and we wrestle with this a little bit and decide that, yes, this is a sin, and somebody else from another church says, well, no, we don't think it's a sin. So how does this work? Because again, he's saying in this passage, 2 or more that coming together in my name, and yet we know there are churches that have problems with homosexuality, with a variety of different things that are controversial among different churches of different Christian churches. So who's right? I mean, how do you justify that when it says that if 2 or people come in my name, then they're right? Then you're right. Well, then what if 2 other Christians come? Then who's right?
Because that even makes me think of all the holy wars from centuries past, and even you almost see a glimpse of that with some of the war against like Al-Qaeda and some of that, where even though it's the U.S., it's still, you can almost think of it as a holy war, because it's people doing stuff in their God's name. But in the centuries past, with old holy wars, it's all these men getting together and trying to force their religion and Christianity on others, and are killing them in the name of Jesus. And Jesus isn't about, like we talked last time, of who is the Messiah, and don't tell anybody. That people were expecting that warrior leader for them to come in and clear their path and make the land, free the land for Christians, for the Christians and for God's people. But that's not who Jesus is. Jesus is about loving and taking care of one another. So it's, where did people get this idea of, oh, we have to go to war in His name, when that's at least again, from my viewpoint, seems contradictory to what Jesus preaches about.
So if we read that again, and it says that if two or more people come to a conclusion, right, or get to a point where they feel like this is a sin, right, this is something that we shouldn't be doing, that would be the case, and if the person doesn't agree, they should be treated like a pagan or a tax collector.
That was the third, yeah.
Right? And so how does that strike everybody? That seems like if you use that in a misquoted way, it would cause different denominations of Christians to make a decision and then look at the other Christians and say, you got it wrong.
Yeah. Which, I mean, I think has already happened in a lot of cases. And I mean, isn't that also part of how, us Lutherans came along with the 95 Theses?
Yeah, right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you could kind of look at that part in two different ways. I think the way Dave's talking about it and you're talking about it, like what's sins and what's right and wrong, and that certainly can lead to issues and judging people and things between different Christian churches. But then I think you can also think of it as a way to solve conflicts or disputes. If you've got an issue with someone, it's better to go directly and talk to them instead of talking behind their back or complaining to someone else. Do that first, then maybe bring someone else in if that doesn't work, and then bring more people in. So I don't know. I guess you can look at it two different ways, I'm thinking.
Kind of set up like a democracy at that point, being able to bring in multiple people, so then it's kind of voted on.
Yeah. Good point.
So in there, it talks a little bit about discernment, about when multiple Christians get together, Jesus is there, and so therefore, whatever decision they make, if they open up their heart or whatever, then they will come up with the right decision. So, I mean, I think that's a great way to look at like an argument, right? If you come in with an open heart, that eventually you'll get to the right decision. But the question is, how much of the Christian church use that in an effective way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I know that, I mean, obviously we've witnessed a lot of cases where people will say they're doing something in the name of God or in the name of Jesus, but it's, humans being humans, and some people being power hungry use that to further their own ends versus truly doing the word of God or the will of God. So it's hard to come in and where if you go to talk to somebody else about something you believe is a sin, they don't. Well, yeah, like you were saying, who's right? Like how do you work that out? Because you have it, and I think it comes down to people how you also view the Bible. Is do you view it literally and follow every word literally, where okay, yeah, they have marriages between a man and a woman, which goes against the like same-sex marriage and everything, versus obviously that was a belief. There's a lot of things like that, like with slavery, that were products of the time and certainly happened, but obviously now you realize is not a good thing.
Talk about wrestling with something. I mean, I've always wrestled with this idea that if we as a church think we have something figured out, we tend to feel like we've got it right and you've got it wrong to some other church, when really, do we really know that to be the case? And how many, as you mentioned, Evan, it's human nature to kind of think, well, we figured it out, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yay us, we figured it out. But then you wrestle with it a little bit and you say, well, wait a minute, maybe we didn't figure it out. And so that's really makes it complicated. And again, to have a verse like this that says, if you get together and you genuinely get together in my name, I'll help you get to the right spot. I'd struggle with that. Did we get to the right spot?
And as we talk about how would we work through things with others, and obviously you have all these different passages in the Bible that say different things that not every church can agree upon. For me, it's like, okay, boil it all back down to almost to like the Ten Commandments or something. Like, what are kind of the core teachings Jesus had? Which for me, I think obviously one of the big core ones is love one another. So it's like, okay, if we don't agree, or if there's a passage someone doesn't agree on, boil it back down to that, and how does whatever we may be talking about, how does that apply with that core teaching? Is it truly loving your neighbor, and however you're dealing with that, or whatever that thing in question is?
Good point, Evan. I've heard that many times, like, when you're looking at something, you can't quite figure it out, keep in mind the core thing, right? Love God, love others. There's a song, I can't think of the name of the artist. Pretty recent song, that's what it's about. He's like, it's all complicated, but it's really simple. Love God, love others. Anyway.
I feel like a lot of it's complicated by humans.
Yeah.
So not only would we do that here on earth, where we think one Christian group is right and one Christian group is wrong, but then also he adds the extra burden of, oh, and by the way, that's the same way in heaven. Now that you've made this decision, it's not only good now, it's also good for when you're in heaven. And so when people show up at the pearly gates, that sin that you bound on them, 50 years ago, right, is still a sin in heaven. Because we didn't have enough, pressure to say, did we get it right? But it's also, we got it right for our brother. And that just seems really complicated.
So I think going back to that, at least the one question of, what does this call us to do or be or to change, how to change? I feel like we can all agree it's calling us to, on the do side is, to work with our fellow man to make sure we're not sinning. But then when you go to that next step, it's how do you do that, which is where, obviously it's getting more complicated. It's getting more complicated to the fact that we all have different thoughts on the matter, and then you pile on, well, okay, yeah, it's going to be almost multifold to where, okay, it's just not just here, it's up there. So how does that come into, our modern lives? You got to figure out how to do it, but how does that also, play into today's world?
In today's world where we all seem to dig our heels in and yell at each other instead of actually having a great discussion with an open heart, maybe what this passage is really telling us is, if you have disagreements among yourselves, and in this case it was the church, but it's also in our country, in our neighborhood, in our state, whatever you want to call it, maybe it's telling us to go out there with an open heart and trust that God can help show you the way, as opposed to just yelling at each other.
Because us yelling at each other makes it too loud. You always talk about, you have to quiet your heart and your mind to truly be able to hear God. And so if we're yelling constantly, we don't shut up long enough to be able to actually hear him speak to us.
What's the old dad thing? What's the old dad thing that they tell you? You have one mouth and two ears for a reason, right?
Yeah, that's something I've heard from a certain pastor of mine. I remember we have 2 ears and one mouth for a reason. Yeah.
Last week was the easier one. We could start off. We're finding our own weight class, and now, as we've said, none of us are are trained.
Right.
We're just churchgoers.
We're not trained.
So obviously we've been talking. Seems like we're a little. It's one that's stumped us a little bit. There's one that's making us wrestle a bit more than our 15 minutes, 20 minutes that we're doing. So for everybody else listening or watching, how do you interpret this verse? How do you think what do you think it's calling us to do as Christians in the modern life? And how do we go about that? So, make sure to let us know either, if you're watching this on YouTube in the comment sections below, or find us on social media with Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Westlake, and let us know what your thoughts are on this.